This is 9/11, 10 years after, from WMAL and the Museum, where history lives. Here is Torie Clarke.
With us is former CIA Director Jim Woolsey. Let's start with 9/11 itself. Where were you then? What was happening in your life when 9/11 happened?
I was practicing law. I was in the first 2 years of the Clinton administration, and in '95 I left to go back to law practice, and I was in a meeting that morning of the Chief of Naval Operations Executive Panel over in Northern Virginia, an advisory body to the Navy that I'm a member of. And we, after the first plane went into the building, they turned on the television set in the meeting, and when we all saw the second plane go in, the reaction was the same as everyone else, that the world had changed.
You must have had a sense of who would be behind it. You knew a lot of what was going on. You were aware of Al-Qaeda, which many, many, many people in this country were not. Did you immediately jump to where a lot of people did, so that anything that large with that much organization behind it could only have been Al-Qaeda?
I don't know if I thought as about which Islamist organization it was, but a suicide attack of that dimension and nature suggested strongly to me right at the beginning some major Islamist organization, whether it was Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah or whatever. I didn't sort through for a while.
But you saw in the 90s, again, people who were in the business, as I call it, saw this threat growing. So surprise, shock, what was it that was going through your head when you realized what had happened?
We did, but since I left in January of '95, most of the terrorist activity, except for the first bombing of the World Trade Center, which led us, of course, to be pursuing Ramzi Youssef all over the world.
Right.
Except for that, we didn't really have bin Laden's declaration of war on the United States until months later. We didn't have his first attack in Saudi Arabia until late '95 and so forth. So the Islamist terror, at the time I left the CIA in '95, was one thing among a number of things that was going on. But by the end of the decade and the coming of 2000, 2001, we'd had a number of attacks on our embassies in Africa, on the coal in harbor at Aden, and so forth. And it was really quite clear that this connection of Islamist groups, whether solely Al-Qaeda or principally Al-Qaeda or including Al-Qaeda, was very much at war with us, and a war to the death from their point of view.
Right. You know, I always say it's very easy to make policy sitting in nice studios in Washington, D.C. It's always easy to look back and say, oh, we should have done this, that, and the other. But looking back, do you think there's something we could have been doing differently in the late 90s that might have changed the outcome or prevented the outcome on 9/11?
Well, that's a very good question. Had we had, let's say, not perfect, but better foresight than we did, we might have forged closer intelligence relationships even than we have. Some of them are pretty good, but even closer intelligence relationships with many of the countries in the Middle East, because a number of those rulers, say in Jordan and elsewhere, partially because they were friendly to us, partially because they did not run their societies in the Salafi manner that Al-Qaeda and the other terrorist groups want, they were closely connected to us, and we traded information and so forth, but we probably could have turned up that activity by some number of degrees. In terms of warnings, that would have been one of the only things that would have helped. The thing that would have helped would have been to have gotten rid of the wall between the FBI and the CIA that had been created by some Justice Department rulings, so there were a number of circumstances in which the two entities could have worked together a lot more closely, but were kept apart by policy decisions because people were worried about civil liberties issues if the FBI and CIA worked together.
Right. That comes up again and again in conversations. If there's a single thing that comes up more often than not, it is that. It is those walls that have been built up between the agencies. Do you think we've effectively taken those walls down?
We have taken important parts of them down, but not totally. Stuart Baker, who was the General Counsel of the National Security Agency and has had a number of other very important jobs, Department of Homeland Security and so forth, has a book out called Skating on Stilts. And the cover is a guy on stilts and ice skates trying to make use, and it's a very good analogy to what we have forced ourselves into with respect to these barriers in communication. Some of them have been taken down, but not all.
Right, and then there are the cultural differences as well. I used to, we all talked in the Pentagon, we would talk about Goldwater Nichols was the very logical result of the various branches of the military not working together. It made so much sense, and it really helped the jointness of the military. And I always think that we need the national security version across the federal government of Goldwater Nichols. To get all these different entities working together in a coherent and consistent way, there needs to be something that can forge that jointness and not allow these episodic things to occur where the silos do go up. Even if it's briefly, those silos do go up. They go up when they go down. But I just think there needs to be something that more comprehensively and more consistently allows there to be jointness in our national security approaches.
I think there are two things. First of all, each agency, National Security Agency, National Reconnaissance Office, CIA, et cetera, there's often some degree of stovepiping, although I think that's gotten better and less in recent years. On the other hand, we can't say that the only virtue is sharing. This intelligence business is not like a kindergarten sandbox in which you want to just teach everybody to share.
Right.
I always tell people that the CIA shared a lot with Ames and the FBI shared a lot with Hansen, and each of them shared a lot with the Russians. But we had a lot of sharing, a lot more than we wanted. So you have to both share exactly the way you want to and with exactly the right analyst, say, in another agency who has a lot to contribute, but not have a system in which one private first class, as happened here within the last year, a teenager, could get into all of the State Department's secret-level cables, give them to WikiLeaks, and have them in the press all over the world. I mean, that was sharing, but it was certainly not the kind we wanted to do.
Yeah. That takes me down another path, and I've always wanted to ask you this. Clearly, in my opinion, too many people have access to classified information. A, do you agree with that? And B, what about the thought that we classify too much? My theory is that we way overclassify information for lots of different reasons. And the end result is we actually sort of cheapen the brand, if you will, of Intel, and we just make it even harder to protect that information which really does need to be protected.
As a general proposition, I think I'd agree with that. But the reason one private first class, a teenager, could have access to so much was that apparently he was sort of a halfway decent hacker. And the SIPRNet, or secret level Internet, which had hundreds of thousands of people on it with a secret level or clearance, had many fewer people than are on the web, or billions on the web. But hundreds of thousands is still a lot.
Right.
And it was modeled after the World Wide Web. So even though people had to have a secret level clearance to get on it, it was still a structure that was given to mainly sharing. The web, of course, was DARPANet in the first instance,
right,
and invented by the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. And in the beginning, back there in the late 60s, 70s, early 70s, it was among people who knew one another, professors at Stanford and Cal and MIT and so forth, coming up with this new thing called packet switching that let them have this new thing called email. And everybody, it was constructed in such a way that everybody had access to everybody, and people who put it together strongly believed that that was the right way to do it. And so as time has gone on and we've tried to apply this type of structure, like the Internet, to other uses, whether it's much smaller, intelligence information, or it's something like providing the control systems, the supervisory control and data acquisition systems, SCADA systems for our electricity grid. These are things you don't want to have the ability to share with everybody.
Right.
You want that information to be quite restricted. You want to be able to get it to exactly who you want to get it to, but nobody else. And unfortunately, because of the way the Internet was originally constructed, it's more or less designed to make it hard to block people out. It's not impossible. There are firewalls, but some of them are useful, some of them are pretty useless. And other security measures, and we don't really have the right kind of security measures because the Internet itself and its derivatives, like SIPRNet, are structured in such a way as to be biased, essentially, toward letting everybody have access to everything.
Right. Biasness toward openness. Okay, so talk about, you've been involved in national security for many, many, many years. Talk about how you think we're doing in the war on terror, as most people understand it, and then more broadly, are there other threats we're not paying attention to that we ought to be?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's a war on terror. Terror is a tactic, a devastating one, but that would be like saying World War II in the Pacific was a war on kamikazes.
Right.
We have a major struggle going on, and it's not our choice to have it, with the Islamist movement. And I say Islamist to connote a totalitarian movement that has some of its roots in Islam, but not a war with Islam. I knew slightly Abdul Rahman Wahid, the former president of Indonesia. What a marvelous man. Mm-hmm. What a great spokesman for religious liberty and the leader of the most populous Muslim country in the world, Indonesia. But there are other branches of Islam, such as the Saudi branch, the Wahhabis, that have indirectly, at least, I guess I would say, spun off a set of views which are really quite similar to Al-Qaeda's point of view and some of the Muslim Brotherhood organizations' point of view, which are very repressive of women, believe in death for apostates and homosexuals, want to establish a caliphate, a worldwide caliphate, a religious dictatorship, and so on. And unfortunately, we have a hard time, and I think this is our biggest problem. We have a hard time speaking clearly about these issues because people don't want to tread on the toes of a religion. But, you know, if we were living back in the late 15th century in Spain, we wouldn't be able to understand the Spanish Inquisition unless we understood that it was an offshoot of one part of that time of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And we can't understand the Islamists unless we understand some of the roots in Islam, or at least part of Islam, and be candid about it and not get scared off talking about it because people say you're an Islamophobe. Well, you know, if you were opposed to the Spanish Inquisition in the late 15th century, in Spain, you were not a Christian phobe. You were somebody who didn't think that Jews and Muslims and dissident Christians should be burned at the stake.
Right, right. Is that what worries you the most? Not that you lose sleep over everything. I know you to be a very confident fellow, so you don't lose sleep over much. But what do you worry about the most in terms of the basic national security protection of this country?
I think in terms of the tactics of what might be utilized against us, it's the electricity grid that bothers me more than most anything, because we do not have a good national system for protecting it. Since the Y2K changes took place a decade plus ago, we have moved more and more to controlling electricity on the Internet, and what that in turn means is, since we have 18 critical infrastructures in the U.S., water, food, sewage, etc., and all 17 of the others depend on electricity. If terrorists take down or hackers take down part of the electricity grid, we're not living back in the 1970s pre-internet, pre-web. We're living in the 1870s pre-electric grid, and we don't have enough plow horses and we don't have enough pump handles.
Right. Now, you are, in addition to all your other talents, an expert on energy dependence, independence, however you want to describe it. Talk a little bit about that and the connection you make to our national security.
Well, I think coal and electricity is an issue of improving the cleanliness with respect to CO2 and other pollutants, and it's also on the side of energy vulnerabilities. It's the nature of the control systems, the controlling the grid by the internet, that to me is a huge national security problem we've just got to fix. On the transportation side of things, our dependence on oil is about 95% for transportation across the world. And OPEC controls nearly 80%, about 78% of the world's reserves of conventional petroleum. So OPEC sets the price. I mean, they argue among themselves sometimes of whether it ought to be $105 or $95, but they set the price. They pump less oil than they did in the 1970s. They control, as I said, nearly 80% of the world's conventional oil, but they only supply about a third. The reason is that OPEC is a conspiracy and restraint of trade, as American antitrust law would call it, and they are withholding production from the market in order to drive up the price for you and me. We borrow at today's oil prices and purchase levels about $1 billion a day just to import oil. It has all sorts of negative security implications. One is that the part of the weakness of the dollar is caused by that. Part is that as oil is sometimes called what's sometimes called the oil curse. Tom Friedman in his book Hot, Flat, and Crowded has a marvelous chapter called "Fill Her Up with Dictators."
Right.
And it's not an accident that of the approximately 22 countries in the world that depend on oil for 60% or more of their national income, all 22 are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. And of the top 9 oil exporters in the world, 8 of them, except all but Norway, are dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms. It's because the economic rent from the oil, when it comes into a country that is governed by a dictatorship or a small group of autocrats, the economic rent, the extra cash they get, is so huge it goes to enhance their position and their control. And Friedman's right. And so by depending completely on oil, we are enhancing the role and the power of the dictatorships, some of whom, like Saudi Arabia, spawn movements such as Wahhabi Islam and Al-Qaeda that are very, very negative to our own interests in peace and democracy and the rule of law.
So it always seems to me as though this issue, our energy dependence, our energy vulnerability, as you call it, is a perfect opportunity for people on the left and people on the right to work together. And you're a smart guy,
agree.
and you understand Washington. Why has it not happened?
You know, first of all, most of the liberal interest and concern on oil has been really focused on climate change. And on the conservative side, it tends to be some of the national security issues like the ones I mentioned here. And I think they're both important issues, right, as are the pollution that is caused by the benzene in your gasoline tank, which is used to enhance octane and is a carcinogen every bit as much as lead was that we got out in the 70s. I think of oil as doing one thing right. It concentrates a lot of energy into a relatively small volume that's easy to transport. Other than that, I look on oil in a way, the way I think the FBI in the 1920s looked on Al Capone. He did an awful lot of things wrong, and they tried to get him for murder. They couldn't, so they got him for tax evasion. And my view of oil is we have to get off of it. We have to move toward alternative fuels, toward electricity, toward natural gas. And if you can't convince people of that because of climate change, if you're a liberal, then start learning about the national security issues. And if you can't convince them on the national security grounds, learn about benzene and why why gasoline tanks the way they're now filled are giving us cancer. There are a lot of things oil does wrong, and we really ought to be focusing on moving toward alcohol fuels, not just ethanol, but methanol made from natural gas itself, electricity. We can do these things relatively quickly if we put our minds to it.
Got it. Okay, put your CIA hat back on. And as at the CIA, you are acutely aware of our standing in the world and how different countries are perceiving us and how we are able to influence and work with them for better and for worse. Where do you think we are right now?
Well, right now, I think things are not going very well in that direction. On the one hand, the Arab Spring, all of those millions of people out demonstrating and in some cases bringing down autocratic rulers, I don't remember a single placard that attacked the United States or Israel. People say that our position on dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian issues is what makes us unpopular in that part of the world. But I don't remember a single placard about that. The people, understandably, of Egypt and other countries were demonstrating against dictators and autocratic kings who controlled them, and they wanted their liberty. If we had been the major cause of all this tension in the Middle East, somebody certainly would have called it to the public's attention, but that's not what they were rebelling against. And from that point of view, we're actually looking fairly good. But I think the Obama administration has, in the Middle East especially, has been pretty tough on some people we've had good relations with for a long time, like Mubarak, and very easy on the really bad guys in the Middle East, like the Syrians and the Iranians. We had no reaction at all to Ahmadinejad stealing the Iranian election 2 years ago. The administration didn't. So I think the administration has tilted too much toward being nice to our enemies and being tough on our friends. And I'm not quite sure what the president thinks he's doing by taking a long time to even criticize Syria for its murderous ways and thinking that he's going to have negotiations with Iran and so not criticizing it much until relatively recently. Why are we being so nice to the governments of Iran and Syria, or why were we so nice so long? I don't understand that.
Right. Okay, so it's 10 years after 9/11. Do you think we're safer?
Well, we are certainly more alert to some of the things that could be used against us that we weren't paying attention to before, like, say, we've toughened up our cockpit doors in airliners. All of the nonsense you have to go through at the airports probably does help some with respect to some types of terrorism, although it's not nearly as effective, I think, as the way some other countries run it, such as Israel. But we are, I think, lagging in understanding what we're dealing with. This Islamist movement, which touches a number of people in the Middle East, although there are obviously hundreds of millions of perfectly reasonable Muslims that we can work with that are on the moderate and sensible side of things. But the Muslim Brotherhood organizations and the Islamists and the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, the Iranian government and its leadership, Hezbollah, Hamas, all these groups really, their thoughts about us are quite totally lethal. And they are true believers. The Soviets basically kind of gave up on their ideology by the late 50s or 60s. It was a cover story, and they didn't want to die for the principle of each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. They wanted to fix up their dodges. They're probably more true-believing revolutionary Marxist-Leninists by the early 60s in the bookstores of the Upper West Side of Manhattan than there were in the Kremlin. But the Islamists are different. They really, really believe, a number of them, that if they can just kill us, then they can go to heaven and we'll go to hell, and that's what you want to do.
Right.
And we haven't really faced an enemy with this type of quasi-religious motivation since we had to deal with the kamikazes in the Pacific in World War II. And it's hard for us. We're a First Amendment country. We're almost all descended from one type of religious immigrant or another, or refugee or another. We are pretty good. We're not perfect, but we're pretty good about believing that everybody gets to worship however he or she wants. And we don't like having to deal with an ideology like Islamism that grows out of one of the world's great religions. But this is hard. It is really hard for us, and it will be a huge struggle to figure out how best to deal with this Islamist problem, I think, as the years go on.
Great words.
This is 9/11, 10 years after. From WM.